In the year 1824, a chief engineer named Benjamin Wright set about 2,600 men to work digging a canal across the narrow neck of land where Maryland meets Delaware. Before those men were finished, 5 years later, they would carve a trench 3 miles long straight down through a ridge of high ground, moving the earth by hand, and they would fight an enemy that no engineering drawing had ever prepared them for. More than 375,000 cubic yards of earth would slide down off the walls of that trench and fall back into the channel the men had just dug out. This place is called the Deep Cut of the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, and it is one of the hardest things ever carved by human hands on the American continent. Their canal is still open and working today, but almost no one remembers how it was born or who paid for it with their backs. The idea behind this canal was far older than the men who dug it. It reached back into the colonial mind, to surveyors and merchants who looked at a map of the Atlantic coast and saw a problem worth a lifetime to solve. The Delmarva Peninsula is a long arm of land that hangs down between two great bodies of water. On its western side lies the broad Chesapeake Bay. On its eastern side lie the Delaware River and Delaware Bay. A ship that wanted to pass from one to the other had no short way across, because the peninsula stood in the way like a wall of earth. The dream was to cut a channel straight through the narrow neck at the head of that peninsula, joining the two great bays, and turning a voyage of many hundreds of miles into a passage a vessel could make in a single day. That dream was written into law very early. The Chesapeake and Delaware Canal Company was chartered in the year 1802, which makes this one of the very first canal projects in the young United States. Historians have sometimes called it the parent of American canals, because it was conceived and chartered before the great canal boom that would later sweep across the country. But a charter is only ink on paper. Between the signing of that charter and the first true digging lay more than 20 years of surveys, of arguments over money and routes, of plans begun and abandoned, of treasuries that ran empty. The work stopped and started more than once. It was not until the year 1824 that the shovels finally bit into the ground for good and stayed there. To understand why men would suffer to build such a thing, you must understand what it saved. Without the canal, a merchant vessel carrying flour, coal, lumber, iron, or grain between the Chesapeake and the Delaware had to sail the long way around. That meant running the whole length of the Chesapeake Bay, out past its mouth into the open Atlantic Ocean, down and around the southern end of the entire Delmarva Peninsula, past Cape Charles and up the coast toward Cape Henlopen, and then in through the mouth of Delaware Bay. It was a detour of several hundred miles, open to Atlantic storms, to hidden shoals, and to the loss of both ships and men. For the merchants of Philadelphia on the Delaware and of Baltimore on the Chesapeake, two of the busiest ports in the nation, a channel of about 14 miles across the neck of the peninsula was worth almost any price. Remember the age this was. The early 1800s were the dawn of the great canal age in America, a time before the railroad ruled, when the surest way to move heavy freight was by water. A loaded wagon dragged over the rutted dirt roads of that era could carry only so much, and it broke down men and horses alike. But a single boat on a canal could carry many tons behind one team walking the towpath. Whole fortunes and whole cities would rise or fall on who could move goods cheaply. To cut a canal through a ridge was, in that day, as bold and as costly as anything a young country could attempt. It was the frontier of engineering, and the men who led it were pioneers of a new profession that barely yet had a name. The man they trusted to lead it was Benjamin Wright. If you have never heard his name, you ought to know it, for he is often called the father of American civil engineering. Wright had earned that title on the greatest public work of the age, the Erie Canal across the state of New York, where he served as chief engineer of a project that opened a continent to settlement and trade. He was not a man schooled in the old academies of Europe. He had come up as a land surveyor and had learned his engineering the hard way, out on the real ground, with real water and real stone teaching him their stubborn lessons. When Wright took charge of the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, he carried the hard-won knowledge of Erie down to the neck of the Delmarva Peninsula. But this ground would test even him. Working on the project was another remarkable and difficult man, the surveyor and engineer John Randell, Jr. Randell is remembered for something you have almost certainly seen with your own eyes, even if you never knew the name behind it. It was John Randell Jr. who laid out the great street grid of Manhattan in New York City, the orderly march of numbered streets and avenues that still governs that island to this day. He was brilliant, exact, and inventive, and he was famously hard to work with. He designed his own surveying instruments and measured with a stubborn precision that made lesser men impatient. On the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, his path with the company would end in bitter dispute, as such things often did with Randell. But his skill was real, and his hand is in the surveying of this passage through the ridge. Now we come to the central problem of the whole project, the reason this canal earned its terrible reputation. Running across the neck of the peninsula was a spine of high ground, a low but stubborn ridge. A canal is not a road. Water will not climb a hill on its own. If you wish to carry a channel of water across a ridge, you have only two real choices. You can lift the boats up and over the high ground with a long ladder of locks, raising them step by step, and then lowering them down the far side, which demands an endless supply of water poured in at the very top. Or you can refuse to climb the ridge at all, and instead cut down through it, carving the solid land away until the floor of your channel is low enough for the water to lie flat and quiet across the gap. The engineers chose to fight the ridge head-on. Their plan called for a summit level, a stretch of canal held at one steady height across the high middle of the route, guarded by locks at either end that would step vessels up from the Chesapeake side and back down to the Delaware side. But to hold that summit level across the ridge, the men could not simply skim the surface of the land. They had to remove the whole crown of high ground that rose above the waterline. They had to dig a canyon through it. That canyon is the Deep Cut, and it became the beating, bleeding heart of the entire story. Of the roughly 14 miles of the finished canal, about 3 of those miles ran through this one section, and those 3 miles would swallow more labor, more money, and more suffering than all the rest combined. So who did the digging? Not machines. There were no steam shovels in the 1820s, no excavators, no engines of iron to bite the earth. This canal was dug by the muscle of living men. At the height of the work, a force of about 2,600 men labored along the line at any one time. And here we must be careful and honest, because these men were not one single people to be lumped under one word. This labor force was made up of 2 groups. There were Irish immigrants, men who had crossed the ocean from Ireland and taken up the pick and the shovel because such work was what the newly arrived and the poor were given. And laboring alongside them were African American men, whose sweat went into this channel just as surely as any other. Both groups built this canal. Both deserve to be named, and named apart. So before we go down into the very worst of it, hold on to this one thought. The marvel of this canal was never made of drawings alone. It was made of men who woke before the dawn and climbed down into a widening pit, day after day, to move the bones of a ridge one barrow load at a time. That labor is the real monument here. If you believe those men deserve to be remembered, by name and by group, then take one moment now to subscribe to Global Old History, and stay with us, because the hardest part of this story is still ahead. Consider what their days were like. For wages of about 75 cents a day, these men worked the raw ground with picks, with shovels, with hand barrows, and with carts pulled by horses. They broke stone, they loaded earth, they pushed and hauled the spoil up out of the trench and away to the banks. This was Maryland and Delaware in the 1820s, and these were slave states in that era. The records that come down to us speak of Irish laborers together with African American laborers on the works, but they do not tell us cleanly whether those African American men were free or enslaved. So we will not pretend to a certainty we do not have. What we can say, and what we ought to say plainly, is that African American hands and Irish hands together carved this passage through the earth, side by side, for pennies a day, in heat and cold and mud. Think about the plain physical fact of what that meant. To dig a canal by hand in that age was to attack the ground in a slow, grinding rhythm that never let up. A man loosened the earth with a pick, or drove his shovel into it, lifted it, and turned it into a barrow or a cart. When the barrow was full, another man wheeled it up a plank ramp out of the deepening trench, dumped it, and brought the empty barrow back down. Multiply that by 2,600 men, hour after hour, day after day, season after season, for 5 long years. There was no machine anywhere to relieve them. Every foot of depth in that channel, every yard of its width, was won by a human being lifting a load and carrying it away. That is the true engine that built this canal, and it had a heartbeat and a name. It is hard, from our modern vantage, to grasp how daring this whole undertaking truly was. In those years, there was no deep well of American experience to draw upon for a work like this. There were no colleges turning out trained engineers by the hundred. The profession itself was being invented, right there on the ground, by men like Wright and Randell, who had to reason out for themselves how to move a river of earth and how to hold back a hillside. Every great cut, every lock, every embankment was in some measure an experiment. When they set out to drive a canal down through the ridge of the Delmarva Peninsula, they were attempting something for which there was no reliable precedent anywhere in the young country, and they knew it. They were writing the book even as they dug. Now, to that hardest part. The deep cut ran about 3 miles, and it was not driven through clean, honest rock that a man could split and stack like a wall. It was driven through some of the worst ground imaginable for such a task. It was a treacherous mixture of boulders, of gravel, of sand, of clay, and of water, all layered and churned together, with no order a man could count on. In one stretch, a laborer might sink his pick into a heavy blue clay that clung to the iron like glue and had to be pried loose. In the next stretch, he might strike a great buried boulder that had to be broken apart or dragged out whole by chains and horses. And everywhere there was water, seeping and welling up out of the floor and the sides of the cut, turning the ground soft and heavy and treacherous underfoot. As the men dug downward, the cut grew into a true canyon. At its deepest, the deep cut carried the bed of the canal far below the natural surface of the land, so that a man standing at the top edge looked down a long, steep slope to the narrow ribbon of channel waiting at the bottom. The walls of that canyon could not stand straight up. They had to be shaped, sloped back at an angle, so that, in theory, they would hold their own weight and not fall. Engineers call these the regulated slopes, the carefully cut faces of the trench. On paper, the slopes were figured to stand. In the real, wet, unstable ground of the Delmarva Ridge, they would not stand. And that single failure became the defining nightmare of the whole enterprise. Here is the number that tells the story better than any adjective could. More than 375,000 cubic yards of earth slid down from the regulated slopes of the deep cut and fell back into the channel that the men had already dug clear. Let that figure settle on you. Try to picture 375,000 cubic yards of earth. It is not a heap. It is a mountain of material, enough to bury long stretches of the canal over and over again. The men would dig a length of the channel clean, shape its slopes just so, and then the saturated ground above them would let go and come down in a slow, heavy avalanche of mud and gravel and stone, filling the very trench they had just emptied by hand. Imagine, if you can, the feeling of that. Imagine spending a week of brutal labor, clearing a length of the cut, hauling every barrow of spoil up and out and away, and then arriving one gray morning to find that the slope had slumped in the night and the channel was full again, as though your whole week had never happened. Then you pick up your shovel and you do it over. And when the ground slides once more, you do it over again. This is not a legend polished up for effect. It is the plain arithmetic of the deep cut. Every one of those 375,000 cubic yards that slid back in had to be dug out a second time, by the same hands, with the same tools, for the same 75 cents a day. There was mortal danger in it as well. When a wall of water-soaked earth lets go above men working at the bottom of a deep cut, there is little warning and little time to climb clear. The work was heavy, the ground was faithless, and the margins were thin. Every barrow of that endless spoil had to be balanced on a narrow plank ramp and pushed up out of the deepening pit by the strength of a man's own back and legs. Horse carts carried the loads away to be dumped in great spoil banks alongside the line of the works, where the earth of the ridge slowly piled into new hills of the men's own making. There were no hydraulics, no engines, no relief but rest and food, and the coming of the next hard dawn. If that curse of the sliding slope sounds familiar, it should, because it was not the last time American engineers would meet it. Decades later, and far to the south, the builders of the Panama Canal would fight the very same enemy at the Great Culebra Cut, where whole hillsides of soaked earth slid down into the channel again and again, and buried the work of months in a single afternoon. The men of the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal met that same foe first, back in the 1820s, with far less machinery and far less knowledge to aid them. When you understand that the sliding ground of a deep cut would still be humbling the greatest engineering project on Earth most of a century later, you begin to grasp what these Irish and African American laborers were truly up against in the deep cut of the Delmarva Ridge. All of this had a price, and the price was staggering. The deep cut, with its endless landslides and its ground that would not hold, devoured money as fast as it devoured labor. Earth that must be dug 2 and 3 times over is earth that must be paid for 2 and 3 times over. The cost of the works ran far beyond what anyone had reckoned when the digging began, and more than once the company that owned the canal was pushed to the very edge of ruin, its treasury drained by the ridge. It is one of the quiet truths of great construction that the ground itself keeps the final bill, and on the Delmarva Peninsula, the ground charged a cruel rate. Only stubbornness and fresh infusions of money carried the project through to its end. It is worth pausing here to honor both groups of these laborers once more, because the pattern was larger than this one canal. All across the young United States in those years, it was Irish immigrants who dug the canals, who drained the swamps, who broke the stone, arriving with little and selling the only thing they had, which was the labor of their own bodies. And across the Chesapeake region in that same age, African American men, both free and enslaved, bore an enormous share of the heavy public labor that built the roads and the landings and the waterways. On the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, these two streams of labor ran together in the same trench. We do not hold a clean ledger telling us the exact standing of every man. What we hold is the plain fact that Irish and African American laborers together opened this passage, and that both names belong upon it. High above that terrible notch in the earth stood one of the true wonders of the project, the Summit Bridge. When the men cut the canal down through the ridge at the place in Delaware that came to be known as Summit, they left an enormous gap in the land where a road had once run level across the high ground. That old road now climbed up to the lip of a canyon, with nothing on the far side but open air. So the builders threw a great covered wooden bridge across the void. It spanned about 250 feet between its abutments, carrying the road high over the canal far below. A covered wooden span of that reach, arching over a canyon dug by hand, was a striking and almost unlikely sight in that era, and it let the ordinary life of the countryside, the wagons and the walkers and the riders, go on crossing over the very wound the diggers had opened. After 5 years of this labor, the canal at last was opened. In the year 1829, water filled the channel from the Chesapeake to the Delaware, and vessels began to slip through the neck of the peninsula that had blocked their way for as long as anyone could recall. The original canal ran about 14 miles from end to end. It was not the flat sea-level channel we know today. It used locks to lift and lower the boats, and it held that guarded summit level up across the high ground through the deep cut. For the men who had survived the digging, and for the engineers who had staked their names upon it, the sight of the first boats gliding through the finished cut must have been worth a great deal. But the canal was not yet done making trouble. In its first long life, this was a canal in the old sense of the word, a quiet ribbon of water where vessels did not steam through under their own power as they do today. Boats were worked along it slowly and carefully, drawn and guided through the locks and the reaches, and every passage paid a toll to the company that had sunk so much money into the ground. It was a toll road of water, a private enterprise built to earn back the fortune it had cost. For decade after decade, the tolls came in as the flatboats and the schooners and the barges crossed the neck, and the canal held its place as a working link in the coastwise trade, even as steam and iron began, elsewhere, to change everything about how a nation moved its goods. And there was the endless matter of the water itself, for a canal, once dug, must be kept alive with water. A summit-level canal is a thirsty thing. Every time a vessel passes through a lock, a great gulp of water spills away downhill and is lost, and the summit must be fed from some source, or it will run low and the whole passage will fail. The engineers had to find a way to keep lifting fresh water up into the highest reach of the canal, faster than the locks and the leaks could drain it away. At first they made do with the natural flow they could gather from the land around them. But it was never quite enough, and so, in time, they turned to the new power of the age, the power of steam, to answer a problem as old as canals themselves. In the year 1837, some years after the opening, a steam pump was installed to raise water up into the canal from a creek nearby, so that the summit would stay full and the boats could keep moving through it. Then, in the year 1852, they built something even more striking to answer the same thirst. The steam pump was replaced by a steam engine that turned a great water wheel, an enormous wheel that scooped water up out of the creek and lifted it into the canal above. It was a marriage of the ancient and the new, the old idea of the water wheel driven now by modern steam, all of it laboring to keep the high heart of this canal supplied. These machines came after the digging was done. They were not the work of the 2,600, but the answer to a burden those diggers had left behind. And for all its troubles, the canal did the very thing it was built to do. It knit together the trade of two great American ports. Ships no longer had to make the long and dangerous run down and around the whole Delmarva Peninsula and back up the open coast. Now they crossed the neck in a single sheltered day. Coal and grain, lumber and iron, flour and merchandise of every kind moved between the Chesapeake and the Delaware through the channel that the Irish and African American laborers had cut. Philadelphia on the Delaware and Baltimore on the Chesapeake were drawn closer together than the geography of the coast had ever before allowed. The canal became a working artery of the young nation's commerce, and it carried the traffic of the region decade after decade, even as the restless ground of the deep cut kept the engineers forever busy holding its slopes in place. Now here is where the story turns, and turns in a direction that most canal stories never take. You have to understand that the 1800s and the early 1900s became a graveyard for American canals. Hundreds upon hundreds of miles of hand-dug canals across this country were built at enormous cost, thrived for a brief season, and then died, killed by the railroads that could haul freight faster and cheaper over any ground and in any weather. Most of the great canals of that age are gone now. Their channels lie drained and filled, their towpaths turned to walking trails, their stone locks standing empty and broken in the woods for hikers to puzzle over. The Chesapeake and Delaware Canal could very easily have died that same quiet death, but it did not. Instead, it was reborn. The turning point came in the year 1919. In that year, the federal government of the United States bought the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal for about $2.5 million and placed it in the hands of the United States Army Corps of Engineers. This was a decision of national vision. The government looked hard at that narrow neck of land and understood that a passage across it was far too valuable to let crumble away. It should no longer be a private toll ditch forever fighting its own locks and its own landslides. It should become a public highway of water, a permanent part of the maritime spine of the nation. And so the Army Corps took hold of the old hand-dug canal and set out to remake it from the bottom up. What they did over the years that followed was nothing less than a transformation. The Corps resolved to remove the old locks altogether and turn the whole waterway into a sea-level channel, a passage cut down so low that the water within it lay at the same level as the sea at either end, letting ships pass straight through without being raised or lowered at all. By the year 1927, that great work was done. The locks that had lifted and dropped vessels for nearly 100 years were gone. The summit level, that thirsty high reach that had begged for steam pumps and water wheels, was cut away entirely. In its place ran an open, level channel from bay to bay. The locked summit canal that the Irish and African American laborers had dug had become a modern sea-level ship canal. And even then, the work did not stop. A canal sized for the ships of the early 1900s would soon be far too small for the ships that came after. So the Army Corps of Engineers widened it and deepened it, and then did so again, and then again. The channel was enlarged around the time of that first great conversion, enlarged further in the 1930s, and enlarged once more in the 1970s, each time cut wider and dug deeper to carry the ever larger vessels of a new age. Yet every one of those enlargements followed the same neck of land, the same line across the peninsula, the same passage first opened by hand a century before. The engineers of the modern age were, in a very real sense, still finishing the work that the diggers of the 1820s had begun, with their picks and their barrows. Consider the distance the canal has traveled in size alone. The channel the diggers finished was a modest thing by the measure of our day. A shallow, locked ditch, meant for the wooden sailing craft and the small steamers of the 1820s. The waterway the Army Corps operates now is cut broad and deep enough to float ocean-going ships that the men with the picks could never have imagined. Steel vessels longer than a town street, riding low under thousands of tons of cargo. And yet those giants follow the exact line those men surveyed and opened. The modern channel is wider and it is deeper, but it runs where the deep cut runs, through the same ridge, across the same neck, past the same place called Summit, where the great covered bridge once stood high over the water. Which brings us to what stands there today, and to the honest truth of it. The Chesapeake and Delaware Canal in our time is a fully modern, sea-level commercial ship canal, run by the United States Army Corps of Engineers. It is a vital link in the Atlantic Intracoastal Waterway, the sheltered inland sea road that runs down the eastern seaboard, and it serves as a main maritime gateway to the great port of Baltimore. It is not a quiet historical relic. It is a heavy working waterway, carrying on the order of 15,000 vessel transits in a single year, which places it among the busiest ship canals in the entire nation, and, indeed, in all the world. Ocean-going cargo ships, tankers laden with fuel, and towering container vessels pass along it steadily, by day and by night. We should be honest and exact about what that means, because this is an audience that values the truth over the legend. The canal those ships travel today is not plank for plank and yard for yard, the same canal the laborers finished in 1829. It has been rebuilt, it has been widened, it has been deepened, it has been stripped of its locks and lowered to the level of the sea, and enlarged again and again across a full century of modern engineering. In that sense, it is a modernized waterway, remade by the machines and the money of a later age. To pretend otherwise would be to insult the very men who fact-check these stories in the comments. But the passage itself, the line, the very neck of land, is the one that they opened. There is something fitting in where this passage lies. It cuts across the very border country where Maryland and Delaware meet, low and green and easy to overlook, the sort of place a traveler crosses in a single moment without a second thought. Few of the drivers on the high bridges overhead, and few of the crews on the ships below, give a thought to the 1820s, to the picks and the barrows, to the 2,600 men and the 75 cents a day. The canal does not announce its history. It simply works, hour after hour and year after year, the way the men who cut it meant it to work, carrying the trade of a nation through a wound in the earth that has long since healed over into a highway. And that is the thing worth carrying away from all of this. So many of the great hand-dug works of that era are dead and gone, but this one lives. When you stand today on a high bridge above the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal and watch a loaded ocean freighter slide quietly through the notch in the land, you are watching traffic move through a channel whose course was first cut, by hand, through boulders and clay, and ground as wet and treacherous as quicksand, by about 2,600 Irish and African American laborers working for 75 cents a day, fighting 375,000 cubic yards of sliding earth in the deep cut. Their locks are gone and their summit is gone, but the passage they opened is still in daily use, one of the busiest in the world. If their story has moved you, then honor them, remember them, and tamte. Subscribe to Global Old History,